So there's a lot of songs out there, and I don't know about you, but I soundtrack my life. So there's stuff I use certain songs for. There are songs some of you might have on your phone, a playlist that you use when you're working out and or you're riding bike or something, and you got to get those peppy tunes to really get the blood pumping. And then there are sad songs for when you're depressed. The blues actually helps. It feels like it should make you wallow in the blues, but I find it very therapeutic to listen to blues. There are workout songs, angry songs, there's oldies, and the reason I mention it this morning is because this last chapter of Hosea, it's chapter 3, it's been such a short, condensed prophecy by Habakkuk, and Habakkuk writes this prayer that's a song. So listen as I read this morning, chapter 3 from Habakkuk. This prayer was sung by the prophet Habakkuk. I have heard all about you, Lord. I am filled with awe by your amazing works. In this time of our deep need, help us again as you did in years gone by. And in your anger, remember your mercy. I see God moving across the deserts from Edom, the Holy One coming from Mount Paran. His brilliant splendor fills the heavens, and the earth is filled with his praise. His coming is as brilliant as the sunrise. Rays of light flash from his hands, where his awesome power is hidden. Pestilence marches before him. Plague follows close behind. When he stops, the earth shakes. When he looks, the nations tremble. He shatters the everlasting mountains and levels the eternal hills. He is the eternal one. I see the people of Cushan in distress and the nations of Midian trembling in terror. Was it in anger, Lord, that you struck the rivers and parted the seas? Were you displeased with them? No, you were sending your chariots of salvation. You brandished your bow and your quiver of arrows. You split open the earth with flowing rivers. The mountains watched and trembled. Onward swept the raging waters. The mighty deep cried out, lifting its hands to the Lord. The sun and the moon stood still in the sky as your brilliant arrows flew and your glittering spear flashed. You marched across the land in anger and trampled the nations in your fury. You went out to rescue your chosen people, to save your anointed ones. You crushed the heads of the wicked and stripped their bones from head to toe. With his own weapons, you destroyed the chief of those who rushed out like a whirlwind, thinking Israel would be easy prey. You trampled the sea with your horses, and the mighty waters piled high. I trembled inside when I heard this. My lips quivered with fear. My legs gave way beneath me, and I shook in terror. I will wait for the coming day when disaster will strike the people who invade us, even though the fig trees have no blossoms and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. So a few years ago, I did the count. I had 3,924 songs on my iPod. I don't have an iPod anymore. But that was 43 days of straight music if I just let it all play. And I've gathered a whole bunch more since then. So there's a lot to draw from. Music's my therapy, maybe for some of you too. And you may find your pleasures country or rock or rap or punk or oldies. And I wonder which songs put a pep in your step or which ones bring a tear to your eye. And we've been following Hosea. We've been following Habakkuk for a few weeks now, and Habakkuk had raised a concern about violence and evil in the world around him in Israel. And he'd seen it, and he said, how long do I have to keep seeing it? And God pushed him further to look out into the rest of the world and to see evil even beyond his borders. He was looking at things in the right way, but he just wasn't looking far enough. And then Habakkuk said, I will wait on the Lord. And the Lord comes back and says, wait patiently. It'll seem like it's going to be a long time. This prophecy's for the end. Like it's going to be a long time waiting, but eventually things will balance out. And God had warned him that Babylon was going to come and deal with Israel's evil that he'd brought up. And then he had this bigger problem. But that's going to make it worse. They're even worse than us. What are you going to do about them? And why would they get to punish us when we're not quite as evil as them? And God tells them to be prepared to wait a long time, but he'll put that all in order. And now we come to the final chapter of the prophecy, and it begins with those words. This prayer was sung by the prophet Habakkuk. See, you know now why I picked Habakkuk to preach on next, because he's a music guy. He writes this song, and he writes and pours out his heart to God. And he starts with the chorus, the refrain, and he says, I've heard about all about you, Lord. I'm filled with awe by your amazing works. In this time of our deepest need, help us again, as you did in years gone by. And in your anger, remember mercy. It's kind of the theme of the whole song. He'd come back to that refrain like we come back to the chorus and say, and it kind of captures everything he's trying to say. I've heard about your stories about you, God. I've heard all about you, Lord. I know that your amazing works, I'm filled with awe by them. And in this time, we've need you as much as we've ever needed you as the people of God. Help us again as you did in years gone by. That's the prayer of his heart. And in your anger, while you're dealing with the evil and the violence, in your anger, remember your mercy. Go easy on us. Basically, he's saying, God, you've rescued your people before. Do it again, please. And then he comes into verse 1, and he kind of opens up details about what he's talking about. I've heard about your works, and he gets into some of God's works. He says, I see God moving across the deserts from Edom, the Holy One coming from Mount Paran. His brilliant splendor fills the heavens, and the earth is filled with his praise. Mount Paran is the area south in southern Palestine where God had led the people of Israel after the Red Sea deliverance, when he'd taken them out of Egypt, and Egypt had tracked them into the Red Sea, and they crossed over. That's where they went right after they were rescued and got through the Red Sea. And it's that area that Mount Sinai is, where God first met with Moses and gave him the 10 Commandments and the Torah, the law of God, and told them how he wanted them to act as his people, and how he wanted them to treat each other, and how he wanted them to live in the world, to draw attention to his goodness and his faithfulness and his character. And so when he says, I see God moving across the deserts that way, and the Holy One coming from that mount, the people of Israel would have remembered that's the place of rescue. That's the place where God took us when he was faithful to us, when we had ourselves in so much trouble and we didn't know how we were going to get out of it, and he brought us through. And Habakkuk saying, do it again, God. Do it like that. He says his coming is as brilliant as the sunrise. Verse 1, rays of light flash from his hands where his awesome power is hidden. Pestilence marches before him. Plague follows close behind him. When he stops, the earth shakes. When he looks at the nations, they tremble. He shatters the everlasting mountains, levels the eternal hills. He's the eternal one. I see the people of Cushan in distress, and the nation of Midian trembling in terror. Those were powerful forces in his day. And he says, I see them just shaking as God shows up. Where he lays his feet, the earth trembles beneath these enemies of Israel. And he says, was it in anger, Lord, that you struck the rivers and parted the sea? Were you displeased with them? No, you were sending your chariots of salvation. You were rescuing us, God. We're your people. And we needed you, and you showed up just in the nick of time. Do it again, God. God had used the fire and the cloud and the darkness and the sea to lead them and to protect them. And when he says, that God steps into the hillsides, hills are where the people had worshipped other idols. And he says when God shows up, all of those things are shaken because they don't really amount to much. But we're your people, God, and you're going to rescue us, and you're going to take down those false idols, and you're going to take away our enemies. That's what you did before. Do it again. Please, God. And then it comes to verse 2 of the song. Not of the chapter, but of the song that he's writing. And he says, you brandished your bows and your quiver of arrows. You split open the earth with flowing rivers. The mountains watched and trembled. Onward swept the raging waters. The mighty deep cried out, lifting its hands to the Lord. The sun and moon stood still in the sky as your brilliant arrows flew, and your glittering spear flashed, and you marched across the land in anger, trampling the nations in your fury. You went out to rescue your chosen people, to save your anointed ones. You showed up and you rescued us, God. Come on, God. Do it again. Come on, God. We've never needed you more. Show up. Show your power. Rescue us. In your anger, don't forget your mercy. And then he comes to verse 3 of his song, and he says, you crushed the head of the wicked and stripped their bones from head to toe. With his own weapons, you destroyed the chief of those who rushed out like a whirlwind, thinking Israel would be easy prey. You trampled the sea with your horses, and the mighty waters piled high. In Judges 5, there was torrential rains, and the Kishon River had flooded, and the kings of Canaan were overtaken when they were after Israel. And in 1 Samuel 7, there was thunderstorms that God used. And in 2 Kings 18 and 19, plagues defeated the Assyrian army of 185,000 soldiers. God, you can use nature. You can step up. Your power is ultimate over the entire earth. They're after us, God. And I know you said that Babylon was coming for us, and they're powerful, and I'm scared, but you've rescued us before. God, do it again. Please. For 3 verses of the song, he builds and builds and builds, and he reminds them of the time that God had shown up again and again and again and again and shown his power over and over and over in ways that defeated the enemy and showed that idols don't have any power, and showed himself powerful and shown his people his salvation. And Habakkuk saying, come on, God, do it again. Come on, God, jump into history. It's not too late. Show up and save us. And he's poured out his request in song again and again in these verses. He's reminded God and the people that this is how God rolls. This is what he does. And he's just asking God, we could have never needed you more. Show up and do what we need you to do. Please, God. They're going to run us over, and they're going to take us out. But as he sits there in the silence after the 3rd verse, I imagine in the song it gets really quiet. And it's all down to just light instrumentals. And then he comes in with his crackling voice and he says, I trembled inside when I heard this. My lips quivered with fear. My legs gave way beneath me, and I shook in terror. He's in full-blown panic. He's having the worst anxiety attack you can imagine. He remembers that God had said that Babylon would come and Babylon would run them over. And instinctively, he's come out with pouring his heart, and he's told God what he wants. But in the back of his mind, he knows what God said was going to happen. And he's pled with God, but in the silence after the 3rd verse, after he's poured out everything that he's asked God for, it's like he feels the answer deep inside him. And the answer is no, I'm not going to show up and rescue you in the same way this time. And he's scared and he's broken and he feels the anxiety of a prayer that he knows God has told him is not the way things are going. And he comes to terms with the truth of his situation, that God has all things under his control, and this whole situation has gotten so out of hand that God is sorting it out, but the way that God's going to sort it out is not the way that he had hoped, and not the things that he had heard about, and doesn't look like the stories of old this time. And he remembers those stories, and he trusts in those stories. He's a man of God. He's speaking for God. He's a prophet. And even as he pours out his heart with what he wants God to do, he realizes it isn't happening. And you remember the promises that we talked about in that series about Abraham? You remember two of the big promises was that God said, I will protect you, and that he would provide for them as his people. But here he is saying that even though Habakkuk is saying there's evil and he's troubled by the evil in his own country, he still wants to be rescued. He's asked God to protect them from Babylon coming in. And God's told him, that's how I'm dealing with this, and I'll deal with Babylon after, but first, the things that Israel is doing right now, the violence and the evil, they've got to be taken care of. And so it seems like overt protection isn't there. And then Habakkuk goes on with his song, and he says, even though the fig trees have no blossom, and even though there's no grapes on the vine, even though the olive crop fails, and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the field and the cattle barns are empty, he says, even if you don't provide for us, even though it seems like we're not only going to get run over, but we're going hungry here. We don't even have any food. God, the fields seem empty. It seems like you've completely abandoned us in this area. It feels like that. It looks like that. It looks like we're going to get overrun by Babylon. It looks like we have no food. And he says, even though those things are happening, even though that's my circumstance, and when I'm honest with myself, you told me this was going to happen, and I get it. And even though there's no cattle in the barns, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. See, sometimes the world doesn't play to our favor. And some prayers, no matter how fervent and how much we beg, seem to be answered with a no. And although God heals, he doesn't always heal. And although God is powerful and he could overcome our enemies, sometimes they seem to triumph. And sometimes it looks like things are going in such a way that evil will get the last word. But God calls us to be patient and wait. Everything God had said was true about the fact that Babylon was going to come and that they were going to get punished for the things that they'd done and the evil that they'd allowed to flourish among his people. But that wasn't the only word that God spoke. He said that his name would be praised and that ultimately his people would be redeemed. And so Habakkuk says, even though the fig trees have no blossom and there's no grapes, even though the olives crops fail and the fields empty, even though the flocks die, even though the situation isn't playing out to my favor, and even though God doesn't seem to be answering my prayers and doing what I'm asking him to do, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, and I will count on him. He is my salvation, and the sovereign Lord is my strength, even while I'm in what feels like a losing battle. He's made his decision. And he isn't looking forward to what comes next. He's trembling, and he's afraid, and he's shaking with anxiety. But he also worships. I don't think there's any more rejoicing more powerful than even though rejoicing. I don't think there's any more worship more meaningful than when you're hard pressed and it doesn't look like you're getting the victory on the outside, but you hang on to God with all that you have and you admit that he is your strength that will get you through everything that you face, even when the odds are insurmountable and it doesn't look like victory to anyone else. But you know the God that you serve, and he is your strength. And you lean into him at that vital moment. Those even though worship moments are the ones that shape us as the people of God. And in this time, I can't imagine a time when we may have felt as the people of God, when we don't know the future and we don't know what's coming next, and we feel weary and afraid, some of us, many of us, that we feel overwhelmed by circumstances at times. And even though the situation looks dire, our God is worthy of praise. And when we praise in our even though moments, it does something to us and it changes us. And his strength is born in us, and we are shaped in a better way to face everything that we have to face than it would if he just took away the problems and made it go easy on us. And so we choose to be here when it rains and when things are dire and when it doesn't rain. We choose to be here and we choose to worship, and we will show up. Hopefully all of us will show up all this winter, and we will praise God together, whatever happens in the world and whatever it throws at us. We will choose to worship the God who is our strength and our salvation, not only when he's overtly doing things and changing circumstances to benefit us and rescue us, but when it looks like he's absent, because he isn't absent and he isn't powerless. And he isn't skipping us or writing us off. He is still our God. He is still our salvation. And he is still our strength. And so Habakkuk says, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength." And if you have sung those songs that pour out your heart to God, if you have poured out your heart in prayer and everything in you is asking God for a certain situation, could you sort it out this way, God? Could you bring healing and hope? Could you rescue me from my trouble? And it doesn't happen that way. If you lean into those even though prayers and you trust him, he'll be your salvation, and he will be your strength. And as time progresses, you will see him work in you and through you in ways that you cannot imagine.